Incompetent fool! The words ripped through the diner like a gunshot. Coffee, scalding hot, bloomed across Richard Sterling's $1,000 suit. But it wasn't his rage that froze the room. It was his mother, Beatrice. She wasn't looking at the mess or her son's fury. Her diamond-hard gaze was fixed on me, more precisely on the small crescent-shaped scar peeking from beneath my waitress uniform, a birthmark I'd always hidden. What they didn't know, couldn't possibly fathom as they dismissed me as the help, was that scar wasn't a blemish. It was a Sterling family heirloom. They had no idea that beneath the surface, my silent act of kindness to Daniel will change everything. Incompetent fool! The words ripped through the diner like a gunshot. Coffee, scalding hot, bloomed across Richard Sterling's $1,000 suit. But it wasn't his rage that froze the room. It was his mother, Beatrice. She wasn't looking at the mess or her son's fury. Her diamond-hard gaze was fixed on me, more precisely on the small, crescent-shaped scar peeking from beneath my waitress uniform, a birthmark I'd always hidden. What they didn't know, couldn't possibly fathom as they dismissed me as the help, was that scar wasn't a blemish. It was a Sterling family heirloom. They had no idea that beneath the surface, my silent act of kindness to Daniel will change everything. The scent of desperation hung thick in the air of the daily grind. A blend of frying bacon, stale coffee, and something acrid, almost metallic, the smell of dreams deferred. At 24, I, Annalise Parker, moved through the cramped space with a weary grace, a silent ballet of refilling sugar dispensers and wiping down sticky tabletops. 6 years I'd been breathing in this air, letting it settle in my lungs and coat my hope in a fine layer of grease. My cheap polyester uniform, perpetually smelling faintly of yesterday's hash browns, was my armor. My smile, practiced and automatic, was a shield against the hurried glances of customers who saw me only as a pair of hands. My world revolved around meager tips, enough to keep the lights on and food on the table for me and Daniel. Daniel, my 16-year-old brother, was the sun in my sky. He should have been agonizing over pop quizzes and first kisses. Instead, his life was a brutal cycle of breathing treatments, pills, and the constant, terrifying rasp of his failing lungs. Cystic fibrosis was a relentless monster, stealing his air and devouring our savings with equal efficiency. Every extra dollar I scraped together went towards a desperate prayer, an experimental treatment that might, just might, give him a chance at a normal life. That Tuesday, the lunch rush was a cacophony of clattering dishes and shouted orders. I navigated the chaos, balancing a precarious tower of burgers and steaming mugs. Then the bell above the door chimed, announcing an intrusion, a group so impossibly out of place they could have walked straight out of a magazine. The Sterlings. You didn't need to read the society pages to recognize the raw, palpable aura of power that surrounded them. Beatrice Sterling, the matriarch, led the way. Her silver hair, sculpted into an intricate chignon, gleamed under the diner's harsh fluorescent lights. Her cobalt blue Chanel suit, a splash of audacious color, made the daily grind's faded decor look positively sepia-tone. Flanking her was her son, Richard, CEO of Sterling Industries. He had his mother's sharp features, but they were twisted into a permanent expression of disdain. His gaze swept over the diner, as if it were a particularly offensive piece of street art. Trailing behind them like a nervous satellite was Catherine, Richard's wife. Her elegant features were marred by a constant air of anxiety, her eyes darting around as if she expected someone to leap out from behind a ketchup bottle and expose her. And a stern-faced man, built like a brick wall in an expensive suit, stood sentinel by the door. Security. Silence descended. Forks paused midair. Conversation sputtered and died. Gus, the diner's owner, scurried out from behind the grill, wiping his greasy hands on his already greasy apron. Mrs. Sterling, Mr. Sterling, what an honor, he stammered, his face a mask of awe and panic. Our driver had a flat tire, Richard said, his voice clipped and condescending. My mother required a place to sit and a cup of tea. This was the closest establishment. He practically spat the word establishment. Beatrice, however, offered a thin, polite smile. Nonsense, Richard. A change of scenery can be invigorating. A booth by the window, if you please. Gus practically tripped over himself to clear and wipe down the best booth. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was my section. This was it. The biggest, most nerve-wracking table of my life. The potential for a life-changing tip was astronomical, but the potential for disaster felt equally immense. Parker, you're up, Gus hissed, his eyes wide with panic. Don't screw this up. Be quick. Be polite. Don't speak unless spoken to. Taking a shaky breath, I grabbed my notepad and approached the table. I kept my eyes down, focusing on the worn Formica tabletop. Good afternoon. Can I start you off with some beverages? I asked, my voice miraculously steady. Hot water with lemon, Beatrice commanded softly. Black coffee, Richard grunted, already scrolling through his phone. Just water for me, please, Catherine murmured, avoiding eye contact. I scribbled down the order and retreated to the counter, my hands trembling slightly. I prepared the drinks with meticulous care, ensuring the lemon slice was fresh, the coffee steaming hot, the water ice cold. $100 tip could mean a week's worth of groceries. $200 could cover Daniel's copay for his next specialist visit. The possibilities danced in my head, shimmering just out of reach. I returned to the table, my focus laser-locked on the precarious tray. I placed the hot water in front of Beatrice, the water for Catherine, and then turned to Richard. As I leaned forward, a runaway toy car, propelled by a rambunctious toddler in the next booth, slammed into my leg. The world tilted, my stomach lurched. The mug of black coffee slid, teetered, and crashed. Hot, black liquid splashed everywhere. Across the table, onto Richard's pristine suit trousers, and onto my own arm as I instinctively jerked back. A sharp gasp escaped my lips, a mixture of pain from the scalding coffee and sheer, gut-wrenching horror. Incompetent fool, Richard roared, leaping to his feet and brushing furiously at his trousers. Do you have any idea how much this suit costs? I'm so sorry, sir. It was an accident, I stammered, tears of humiliation and panic stinging my eyes. I grabbed a handful of napkins, trying to mop up the mess, my mind screaming. I was fired. I was definitely fired. Gus would throw me out on the street, but it wasn't Richard's fury or Gus's apoplectic face that held the room captive. It was Beatrice Sterling. The matriarch hadn't moved. She wasn't looking at her furious son or the spreading puddle of coffee. Her gaze was fixed with an astonishing intensity on my forearm. In my haste to clean the mess, the long sleeve of my uniform had ridden up, exposing the angry red burn, and just beneath it, a faint, silvery scar. It was a peculiar shape, almost like a stylized bird, or a crescent moon with a single delicate feather branching off from its upper curve. A birthmark. Something I'd always hidden out of a vague, undefined feeling of self-consciousness. Time seemed to freeze. The diner, with its sizzling grill and buzzing fluorescent lights, faded into a muffled backdrop. Beatrice Sterling slowly raised a trembling hand, her perfectly manicured finger pointing directly at my arm. Her face, moments ago a mask of aristocratic composure, was now a canvas of raw, unbridled shock. Her lips parted, and a choked whisper filled the stunned silence. That mark, Beatrice breathed, her voice cracking with an emotion no one could decipher. That mark, it runs in our family. A collective gasp rippled through the diner. Richard stopped dabbing at his suit, his face contorting in confusion. Catherine looked up, her eyes wide with bewilderment. Gus stood frozen by the counter. I could only stare, first at the old familiar scar on my arm, and then at the billionaire matriarch who was looking at me as if she'd just seen a ghost. In that moment, the cracked coffee cup on the floor was forgotten, overshadowed by the shattering of a reality I'd never even known existed. The immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of controlled chaos. The Sterling security guard, Samuel, swiftly and discreetly settled the bill with a stunned Gus, leaving a tip so large it could have covered the diner's rent for the month. Richard, still fuming, but now utterly bewildered by his mother's behavior, was ushering her toward the door, where a sleek black Bentley had mysteriously appeared, its tire evidently fixed. "Mother, this is absurd," he hissed, his voice low but sharp. "She's a clumsy waitress. It's a coincidence. A tattoo, anything. You're making a scene." Beatrice ignored him completely. Her eyes, filled with a storm of emotions I couldn't begin to interpret, remained locked on me. "What is your name, child?" she asked, her voice regaining some of its authority, though a tremor remained. "Annalise. Annalise Parker," I whispered, my own arm still throbbing from the burn. "Annalise?" Beatrice repeated the name, tasting it, finding it both foreign and strangely familiar on her tongue. She turned to Samuel. "Get her contact information. We will be in touch." And just like that, they were gone. The bell above the door chimed their departure, leaving behind a silence thick with questions and the lingering scent of expensive perfume. I stood motionless, the wet napkin still clutched in my hand, my world tilted on an axis I didn't know existed. Gus, after staring at the 5 crisp $100 bills Samuel had left, simply told me to take the rest of the day off, his usual gruffness replaced by a dumbfounded respect. I walked home in a daze, the cacophony of the city streets a dull hum in my ears. I lived in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a rundown part of Queens, a world away from the Sterling's Upper East Side existence. The building smelled of damp carpets and cabbage, a stark contrast to the Chanel No. 5 that had wafted from Beatrice Sterling. I found Daniel on the sofa, a textbook open on his lap, his breathing a little more labored than usual. He looked up as I entered, his bright, intelligent eyes clouded with worry. "You're home early," he said, his voice raspy. "Is everything okay?" How could I possibly explain that a billionaire matriarch thought a scar on my arm was some kind of family crest? It sounded like the plot of a fairy tale. I was too old and too tired to believe in fairy tales, so I just shook my head and managed a weak smile. "Just a slow day. How are you feeling?" The call came the next morning. It was from a woman with a crisp British accent who introduced herself as Beatrice Sterling's personal assistant. She politely but firmly requested my presence at Sterling Manor in Greenwich, Connecticut that afternoon. A car would be sent for me. It was not a question. Panic and curiosity warred within me. This was insane. It had to be a mistake, a cruel prank, or the delusion of a wealthy old woman. But a part of me, the small, desperate part that dreamed of a life beyond stained aprons and medical bills, felt a flicker of impossible hope. For Daniel's sake, I had to go. The car that arrived was the same black Bentley. The leather seats were softer than any bed I had ever slept in. As the car sped out of the city and into the lush, manicured landscapes of Connecticut, I felt like I was shedding my old life mile by mile. Sterling Manor was not a house. It was a kingdom, a sprawling stone mansion that rose from acres of perfectly sculpted gardens. It looked more like a European palace than a private residence. A butler with an impeccably straight back greeted me at the door and led me through halls adorned with classical paintings and centuries-old antiques. The sheer scale of the wealth was suffocating. Every vase, every rug, every ornate chandelier was a testament to a level of existence so far removed from my own, it felt like a different planet. I was shown into a vast drawing room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a serene, private lake. Beatrice Sterling was waiting for me, seated in a high-backed armchair near a grand, unlit fireplace. Richard stood by the window, his arms crossed, his expression a thundercloud of suspicion and resentment. Catherine was perched nervously on the edge of a silk-covered sofa. "Miss Parker, thank you for coming," Beatrice said, her voice calm and measured. "Please sit." I sat stiffly, my hands clenched in my lap. I felt small and shabby in my best pair of jeans and a clean but faded blouse. "My behavior yesterday was abrupt," Beatrice began. "I apologize for any distress it may have caused you, but you must understand my reaction was not without reason." She paused, her gaze drifting to my arm, which I had instinctively covered with my sleeve. "May I see it again? The mark on your arm?" Hesitantly, I pushed up my sleeve. In the soft afternoon light of the drawing room, the scar seemed more prominent, its silvery lines catching the light. Richard scoffed from the window. "Mother, this is a farce. It's a uniquely shaped birthmark. Millions of people have them. You're projecting a fantasy onto a stranger because of a coincidence." "It is not a coincidence, Richard," Beatrice said, her voice sharp as steel, silencing him instantly. She looked back at me. "This exact mark, in this exact location, has appeared on the women of my maternal line for over 200 years. It is called the sterling dove. My grandmother had it. I have it. Beatrice gracefully pulled back the cuff of her silk blouse, revealing her own wrist. There on her aged skin was the identical mark, a crescent moon with a delicate feather, faded with time, but unmistakably the same. I stared, my breath catching in my throat. It was identical. The strange little shape I had always thought was a random quirk of my biology was staring back at me from the arm of one of the wealthiest women in the world. "How is this possible?" I whispered, my mind reeling. "That is what we intend to find out," Beatrice said. "My youngest son, Edward, and his wife, Laura, were lost in a yachting accident 24 years ago off the coast of Montauk. They had an infant daughter with them. Her name was Juliet. The wreckage was found, but their bodies and the baby were never recovered. Juliet would be your age now, Annalise. And her mother, Laura, was my daughter. She had the mark." The implication hung in the air, heavy and unbelievable. Richard let out a short, incredulous laugh. "You can't be serious," he said, turning from the window to face us fully. "You think this waitress, this nobody from a greasy spoon in Queens, is Juliet? Juliet is gone. She died with her parents. This is a pathetic, transparent attempt to swindle you." He glared at me, his eyes filled with undisguised contempt. "Tell me, Miss Parker, how much research did you do? Did you study our family history? Get a tattoo to match? Who put you up to this?" "Richard, that is enough," Beatrice commanded. "No, it's not enough," he shot back, his voice rising. "I will not stand by and watch you be taken in by some grifter. I am the CEO of this company, the steward of this family's legacy. I will not allow it to be jeopardized by your sentimentality." "I don't know anything about this," I said, finding my voice. It came out stronger than I expected. "I didn't ask for any of this. Until yesterday, I had never heard the name Sterling outside of a headline. I've had this mark my entire life." Beatrice watched the exchange, her expression unreadable. "There is only one way to be certain," she said finally, her voice cutting through the tension. "We will conduct a DNA test. Dr. Albright, our family physician, will be here within the hour. He will take samples from you, Annalise, and from me. They will be sent to the most reputable lab in the country. The results will be definitive." She turned her piercing gaze on me. "If you are who I believe you might be, your life will change forever. If you are not, we will compensate you generously for your time and trouble, and you will sign a non-disclosure agreement. Are you willing to proceed?" I looked from Beatrice's hopeful yet guarded face to Richard's sneering hostility. I thought of Daniel, of the crushing weight of our life, of the endless shifts and the gnawing fear of the future. Whatever this was, it was a door to a world I couldn't imagine, but also a door that might lead to answers about a past I had never known. My parents had died in a car crash when I was a baby, or so the orphanage had told me. I had no family, no history, just a scar. "Yes," I said, my voice clear and firm. "I am." Richard Sterling watched me, his eyes narrowing into slits. It was not the answer he wanted, and in his cold, calculating gaze, I saw not just a skeptic, but an enemy. The test would prove the truth, but I had a sinking feeling that, for some people in this gilded cage, the truth was the last thing they wanted to find. The days following the DNA test were a strange, suspended reality. At Beatrice's insistence, I remained at Sterling Manor. It was framed as a security measure to protect me from potential media scrutiny should word of this leak out. But I knew it was also a form of observation. I was a specimen under a microscope. I was given a guest suite that was larger than my entire Queen's apartment. It was decorated in muted creams and golds, with a 4-poster bed, a marble bathroom, and a private balcony overlooking the vast emerald green lawns. A silent, efficient housekeeper laid out a wardrobe of new clothes for me. Cashmere sweaters, silk blouses, tailored trousers. The price tag on a single pair of shoes could have covered Daniel's medication for 6 months. The opulence was a constant, dizzying assault on my senses. I was allowed to call Daniel once a day on a secure line provided by the family. I told him a sanitized version of the truth, that I had been offered a temporary, but very high-paying job as a personal assistant for a wealthy client, requiring me to live on site for a couple of weeks. I had a trusted neighbor, Mrs. Gable, look in on him, and I wired more than enough money to his account to cover any expenses in advance, a sum Beatrice had provided without even being asked. Daniel thrilled at my good fortune and the sudden financial relief, asking few questions. The guilt of the lie was a bitter pill for me to swallow each night. Life in the manor was a study in contrasts. Beatrice was cautiously warm, inviting me for tea in the conservatory or for slow walks through the rose garden. She would ask gentle questions about my life, my childhood in the foster care system, my dreams, but she rarely spoke of the past, of her lost daughter Laura, or the granddaughter named Juliet. It was as if she was afraid to give the ghost a name, lest it vanish if she spoke it too loudly. I sensed a deep, profound grief in the old woman, a wound that had never truly healed. Richard, on the other hand, was a pillar of ice. He treated me with a venomous disdain, making it clear through clipped remarks and icy glares that he considered me an opportunistic fraud. During the few family dinners I was required to attend, he would steer the conversation towards topics designed to highlight my lack of sophistication. Global finance, art auctions, European politics. I would sit in silence, feeling my cheeks burn with humiliation, while Richard would watch me with a smug, triumphant smirk. His wife, Catherine, remained a timid shadow, speaking only when spoken to, her eyes filled with a kind of weary sadness. The manor itself felt like a living entity, filled with secrets. The staff moved with a silent, almost reverential efficiency, their faces impassive masks. I often felt their eyes on me as I wandered the long, portrait-lined corridors. Were they curious, hostile? I couldn't tell. They were as much a part of the house's formidable defenses as the high stone walls and iron gates. One rainy afternoon, driven by a restless curiosity, I found myself exploring the West Wing, an area of the house that seemed quieter and less used than the rest. At the end of a long, dusty hallway, I found a door that was slightly ajar. Peeking inside, I discovered it was a nursery. It was frozen in time, a perfect capsule of a life that had never been lived. A beautifully carved wooden crib stood in the center of the room, a mobile of silver birds hanging motionlessly above it. Tiny dresses hung in a glass-fronted wardrobe, and a collection of pristine, unread storybooks sat on a small shelf. The room was coated in a thin layer of dust, a silent testament to its abandonment. On a small rocking chair in the corner sat a single leather-bound book. It was a photo album. I picked it up, my fingers tracing the faded gold lettering on the cover. Our Juliet. My heart pounded as I opened it. The first few pages were filled with wedding photos of a smiling, vibrant couple. The man had the Sterling family's aristocratic features, but a much gentler smile than Richard. This had to be Edward. The woman beside him was beautiful, with kind eyes and a cascade of dark hair. In every photo, she glowed with happiness. A small handwritten caption identified them. Edward and Laura, June 1999 on. My hand trembled as I turned the page. There were photos of a pregnant Laura, her face full of joyful anticipation. And then, the last few photos. A picture of Laura in a hospital bed, holding a tiny, swaddled bundle. The baby was red-faced and squinting, but on its tiny forearm, just visible as it peeked from the blanket, was a faint, dark mark. It was my mark. A choked sob escaped my lips. I sank onto the rocking chair, the album clutched to my chest. This was real. These people, this beautiful, happy couple, were my parents. The smiling woman was my mother. The baby in the photo was me, Juliet. I was so absorbed in the album that I didn't hear the footsteps in the hall. This wing is kept private. I jumped, startled. A stern-looking woman in a housekeeper's uniform stood in the doorway. Her name was Mrs. Davies, and she had been with the Sterling family for over 40 years. Her face was a network of disapproving lines. I'm sorry, I stammered, quickly closing the album. The door was open. I didn't mean to intrude. Mrs. Davies' gaze softened ever so slightly as she looked at the album in my hands. That room has been sealed for 24 years. Mrs. Sterling couldn't bear to look at it. She stepped into the room, her eyes scanning the dusty surfaces. Gaze softened ever so slightly as she looked at the album in Annalise's hands. That room has been sealed for 24 years. Mrs. Sterling couldn't bear to look at it. She stepped into the room, her eyes scanning the dusty surfaces. After the tragedy, it was as if a part of this house died. A part of her died. She must have loved them very much, Annalise said softly. Mr. Edward was her favorite. Mrs. Davies confirmed with a nod. He was not like his father or his brother. He was a gentle soul, an artist. He never cared for the business. All he wanted was his wife and his baby girl. The housekeeper paused, a flicker of an old memory in her eyes. He and Mr. Richard. They never saw eye to eye, especially after Mr. Gregory Sterling, the patriarch, passed away. Mr. Edward wanted to take his inheritance and leave, start a new life away from all this. What happened? Annalise prompted, hungry for any detail. Mr. Richard fought him, of course, said it would weaken the company, dilute the family's power. The arguments were terrible. The week before they left on that boat trip, the fighting was worse than ever. Mrs. Davies seemed to catch herself, realizing she had said too much. Her professional mask slipped back into place. It was a long time ago. Old history. She took the album gently from Annalise's hands and placed it back on the chair. The results of the test are due tomorrow. It is best to wait for the truth to be official before dwelling on ghosts. With that, she ushered Annalise out of the room, firmly closing the door behind them, sealing the past once more. Annalise walked back to her suite, her mind racing. The fight between the brothers, Edward's desire to leave, it added a new, darker layer to the story. The official narrative was a tragic accident, but the whispers in the walls of Sterling Manor hinted at something more complex. A family fractured by ambition and resentment, and at the center of it all was a baby girl who had simply disappeared, a ghost whose name was Juliet. The next day, a heavy, expectant silence fell over the manor. Dr. Albright was scheduled to arrive at 3 with the certified results from the laboratory. Annalise spent the morning pacing her room, her stomach a tight knot of anxiety. This was the moment that would either shatter the impossible dream or condemn her to a life she could barely comprehend. Meanwhile, Richard Sterling was not idle. Convinced that Annalise was an imposter, he had on the day of the test hired a man named Vincent Thorne, a discreet but ruthless private investigator known for his ability to unearth secrets people thought were buried forever. Richard's instructions were simple. Find dirt on Annalise Parker. Find a criminal record, a disgruntled ex-boyfriend, a history of scams, anything that would expose her as a fraud and discredit her in Beatrix's eyes. Thorne was exceptionally good at his job. He started by digging into Annalise's sealed juvenile records and her time in the foster care system. He interviewed former foster parents and neighbors, but the picture that emerged was disappointingly clean. She was quiet, hard-working, and fiercely protective of her younger brother. She had no vices, no criminal history, not even a parking ticket. Her life was one of unglamorous, relentless toil. Frustrated, Thorne decided to change tactics. If he couldn't find dirt on Annalise, perhaps he could find inconsistencies in the foundation of her claim. He started investigating her birth. The official story she had been told by the orphanage was that she was a foundling left on the steps of a church in a small town on Long Island, with a note that gave only her first name, Annalise, and a date of birth. Thorne traveled to that town. He pulled the original police report from that night 24 years ago. The report was brief. An anonymous call had alerted the police to a baby left in a basket. The note was logged into evidence. Everything seemed straightforward. But Thorne was a man who noticed details. The date on the police report was October 26th. He cross-referenced it with news archives. The Sterling yacht, the Serenity, had been reported missing on October the 24th, 2 days earlier during a violent, unforecasted storm. The wreckage was discovered on the 27th. The timelines were tight but plausible. However, something else in the archived news reports caught his eye. A small sidebar article mentioned that a local woman had reported her car stolen on the night of the 25th. The car was found abandoned the next morning near the very church where the baby was discovered. The police had deemed it an unrelated local crime. Thorne, however, didn't believe in coincidences. He tracked down the woman who had owned the car. She was now elderly, but she remembered the incident clearly. Strangest thing, she told him. They didn't take anything. Just used it, I suppose. Left it clean as a whistle except for one thing. There was sand on the driver's side floor mat. Lots of it. And it smelled of salt, like someone had come right off the beach. The beach. Thorne's instincts flared. He went back to the police report about the yacht. It mentioned where the bulk of the wreckage had washed ashore, a desolate private stretch of beach in Montauk, a good 50 miles from where the baby had been found. He drove to Montauk and spoke with the retired Coast Guard officer who had been in charge of the recovery operation. The old man remembered the Sterling case vividly. A real tragedy, he said, shaking his head. That storm came out of nowhere. We searched for days, but the currents out here, they can take a body miles out to sea in a matter of hours. We never stood a chance of finding them. Did you find anything unusual? Thorne pressed. Anything that didn't fit with a standard boating accident? The officer hesitated. Well, there was one thing unofficially. The emergency beacon on the yacht was state-of-the-art. It was designed to activate automatically on impact or if submerged. It never went off. We found it in the wreckage. The wiring had been cleanly cut. Thorne felt a jolt. Cut wires. That wasn't the signature of a storm. That was the signature of sabotage. While Thorne was unearthing the skeletons of the past, Annalise was making her own discovery. Unable to bear the waiting, she had been drawn back to the West Wing. The nursery door was now locked, but her exploration had led her to an adjacent room, a small study that must have belonged to her father, Edward. It was filled with art supplies, canvases, and books on art history. In the back of a desk drawer, beneath a stack of old sketchbooks, she found a small, locked metal box. After several minutes of fiddling with a hairpin, the lock clicked open. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a collection of letters tied with a ribbon and a small tarnished silver locket. She opened the locket first. On one side was a tiny photo of Edward. On the other, a picture of Laura, her mother. Her hands shaking, she untied the ribbon on the letters. They were not from Edward, but to him. The handwriting was an elegant, looping script. She read the first one. Dearest Edward, I must write to you, though I know you will tell me I am being paranoid. I cannot shake this feeling of dread. The air in this house has grown so cold since your father passed. Your brother watches me. He watches us. He sees Laura and the baby not as family, but as threats to what he believes is his birthright. He speaks of preserving the legacy, but I hear only greed in his voice. He resents your desire to leave, resents that your share of the inheritance would go with you. Be careful, my dear boy. Power makes monsters of men, and this family is built on power. Yours in loyalty and concern, Fiona. Annalise's blood ran cold. She quickly read through the other letters. They were all from this Fiona, and they painted a chilling picture, a picture of Richard's escalating resentment of his arguments with Edward growing more vicious. The final letter was dated October 22nd, just before the fateful boat trip. Edward, he knows you are planning to leave after the trip. I overheard him on the phone with the family lawyers asking hypothetical questions about what would happen to your shares if you were to die without a will. I am terrified. Do not go on that boat. I beg you. Take Laura and Juliet and leave now tonight. Disappear. Your brother is not the man you think he is. I fear he is his father's son. In all the worst ways. Please listen to me. Fiona. Who was Fiona? Annalise frantically searched through the sketchbooks, hoping for a clue. Near the back of one, she found a charcoal portrait of a woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and a severe hairstyle. The caption underneath read, Fiona Juliet's governess, the only one I trust. The governess. Mrs. Davies had mentioned that the family had hired a highly recommended governess for the baby, a woman who had mysteriously disappeared right after the accident, never to be heard. From again, Annalise sat on the floor of the dusty study, the letters spread around her, the locket clutched in her hand. The story of a tragic accident was a lie. These letters were a warning from the grave. This wasn't just a matter of inheritance. It was a matter of potential murder. And the man who stood to gain the most, the man who had looked at her with such hatred from the moment she arrived, was his brother, Richard. At that moment, the chiming of the grandfather clock in the hall echoed through the silent manor. It was 3 a.m. Dr. Albright had arrived. The truth was waiting for her downstairs. But Annalise now realized there was more than one truth to be found. One was in a sealed envelope from a lab. The other was buried in 24 years of lies, and it was far more dangerous. The atmosphere in the drawing room was electric with tension. Beatrice sat ramrod straight in her armchair, her face an inscrutable mask. Richard stood by the fireplace, radiating a palpable aura of hostility. Catherine was a ghost on the sofa, wringing her hands in her lap. Annalise stood near the door, the weight of the letters she'd found, feeling like a physical burden in her pocket. Dr. Albright, a kind-faced man in his 60s, entered carrying a large sealed manila envelope. He cleared his throat, his professional demeanor doing little to ease the suffocating tension. "Good afternoon," he began addressing Beatrice. "I have the certified results from the diagnostics laboratory. They are conclusive." He opened the envelope and pulled out a multi-page report. He scanned it for a moment before looking up, his eyes finding Annalise. "The mitochondrial DNA analysis shows a direct, unbroken maternal link between you, Beatrice, and you, Annalise. He announced the probability of you being the daughter of Laura Sterling, and therefore Beatrice's granddaughter, is 99%. Congratulations. Annalise Parker is without any scientific doubt Juliet Sterling." A collective breath was released in the room. Catherine let out a small tearful gasp and put a hand to her mouth. Beatrice closed her eyes and a single silent tear traced a path down her cheek. She reached out a trembling hand towards Annalise. "Juliet," she whispered the name, finally given voice. Richard's reaction was volcanic. "No, it's impossible. The test is wrong. She bribed someone. This is a fraud," he bellowed, his face turning a blotchy red. "The test is incontrovertible, Richard," Dr. Albright said sternly. "The lab is the most secure in the country. The chain of custody was perfect. This result is legally and scientifically binding." "I don't care," Richard spat, turning his fury on Annalise. "You think you've won, don't you? You think you can just walk in here and claim a part of what my family has built over generations? I will fight you. I will drag your name through the mud. I will prove what you are." "Richard, that is enough." Beatrice's voice cracked like a whip. She rose to her feet, her grief-stricken vulnerability replaced by the steely authority of the Sterling matriarch. "You will welcome your niece into this family, or you will find yourself on the outside of it. Juliet is home. That is the end of the discussion." Richard stared at his mother, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with a mixture of hatred and disbelief. Without another word, he turned on his heel and stormed out of the room, slamming the heavy oak doors behind him. The confirmation of her identity should have been a moment of pure triumph for Annalise, or Juliet, as she now had to think of herself. But the discovery of the letters had poisoned it. As Beatrice embraced her, weeping with a joy that was 24 years in the making, Annalise felt a chilling sense of dread. She was embracing a woman whose own son may have orchestrated the death of her other child. Richard, however, was not a man to accept defeat. His plan to discredit Annalise had failed, so he moved to a more aggressive strategy: containment and sabotage. His first call was not to his lawyers, but to Vincent Thorne. The DNA was a match. Richard snarled into the phone. "The old woman has lost her mind. She's changing her will. The girl stands to inherit Edward's entire original share, held in trust. It's a fortune." "What about my findings?" Thorne asked, his voice calm and professional. "The cut wires on the beacon, the stolen car." "This wasn't an accident, Mr. Sterling." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "That is a complication," Richard said finally, his voice dangerously low. "A complication that needs to be buried. Your investigation is over. You will destroy your files. You will forget into everything you found. Your final payment will reflect your permanent discretion." Thorne was a pragmatist, but he was also a man with a sliver of a conscience. He had uncovered a potential murder, and now his client was telling him to bury it. He knew exactly what that implied. "Understood, Mr. Sterling," he said, but he had no intention of destroying his files. Richard's next move was to isolate Annalise. He began a subtle but vicious campaign within the family and the company. He spread rumors that Annalise was unstable, that her years in the foster system had left her damaged and greedy. He instructed the household staff to watch her every move, reporting back to him. Annalise began to feel like a prisoner in the opulent mansion, her newfound grandmother's affection, a fragile shield against her uncle's relentless hostility. He tried to frame her. One evening, a valuable Faber egg went missing from a display cabinet in the library. Richard immediately accused Annalise, demanding her room be searched. The staff under his orders conducted a thorough search. Annalise stood mortified as they went through her belongings. The egg, of course, was not there. It was found hours later by Mrs. Davis, tucked away behind a book on a different shelf, a place it could have easily been misplaced. But the damage was done. The seed of doubt had been planted among the staff, and Annalise feared, even in Beatrix's mind, the serpent was striking, trying to poison her newfound life before it could even begin. Annalise knew she couldn't fight him alone. She had Fiona's letters. But who was Fiona? A ghost from the past. She needed more. She needed the man who had dug up the truth and then been told to bury it. Using the small burner phone she had kept from her old life, she did some research. Richard Sterling was a man of habit. His financial records showed a recurring payment to Avathorn Investigations. It didn't take her long to find a number. She took a deep breath and made the call, retreating to the far end of the rose garden for privacy. "Thorn," a gruff voice answered. "My name is Annalise Parker or Juliet Sterling," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I believe you were hired by my uncle Richard Sterling to investigate me." There was a moment of silence. "That's confidential client information. I know what you found." She pressed on her voice, gaining strength. "I know you found out the yacht accident wasn't an accident. I have letters from my governess, Fiona, warning my father about Richard. He told you to bury it, didn't he?" Another pause longer this time. "You're playing a dangerous game, Miss Sterling." "Richard is the one playing a dangerous game," she retorted. "He tried to frame me for theft. I don't know what he's capable of, but I think he's responsible for my parents' deaths, and I think he'll do anything to keep his secret. I need your help. I need to find Fiona." Thorne was silent for nearly a minute. He was weighing the risk. Crossing a man like Richard Sterling could end his career or worse. But this young woman had courage, and she had evidence. Combined with his own findings, it was a powerful combination. Finding a ghost who has been hiding for 24 years is not easy. "Or cheap," he said finally. "My grandmother just set up a trust for me." "I can pay you whatever you ask," Annalise replied without hesitation. "It's not about the money anymore," Thorne said, a note of grim determination in his voice. "Richard Sterling made a mistake when he told me to bury a murder. Send me copies of those letters. I'll find your governess." As Annalise hung up the phone, she looked back at the magnificent stone mansion. It was her home, now her birthright, but it was also a viper's nest. Richard had struck at her and missed. She knew his next strike would be harder and more deadly. Finding Fiona was no longer just about understanding the past. It was about surviving the present. Vincent Thorne, a master of finding ghosts, began his search for Fiona Mloud. He discovered the governess had been placed by a high-end agency, and after tracking down its retired owner, found her only emergency contact, a cousin in Vermont. The cousin was wary until Thorne showed her a photo of Annalise, her sterling dove birthmark clearly visible. Recognizing the proof, Fiona had told her to wait for the woman, revealed the truth. Fiona was alive, living in quiet fear under an assumed name in a secluded cottage in Maine. Armed with this knowledge, Annalise knew she could not act alone. She went to Beatrix and laid out the entire conspiracy: Fiona's warning letters, Thorne's discovery of the sabotage beacon, and the fact that the governess was alive. The matriarch was horrified. The potential betrayal of her son, a monstrous thought. But beneath her grief, the sterling steel hardened. She would not allow the family's legacy to be built upon such a devastating lie. The confrontation was staged with cold precision in the manor's grand library. Beatrix summoned Richard for an urgent family meeting, knowing his paranoia and greed would ensure his attendance. As Richard strode in radiating arrogance, a side door opened. An elderly woman with haunted eyes was escorted into the room. It was Fiona Mloud. Richard's face went white with shock. "You!" he breathed as if seeing a specter. "Hello, Richard," Fiona said, her voice trembling but clear. It has been a long time. Ignoring his blustering accusations, she began her story at Beatrix's command. She recounted the terrible arguments between Richard and Edward, explaining that Edward had uncovered their father Gregory's criminal dealings and planned to use them as leverage to leave the family peacefully. Richard saw it not as leverage, Fiona explained, but as a threat to the entire Sterling legacy. Her voice dropped to a whisper as she described seeing Richard near the yacht with a tool bag the night before the fateful trip. She told them of the safe deposit box Edward had entrusted to her, filled with cash and incriminating documents, along with a final desperate plea. Protect my daughter. Don't let my family raise her. Fiona then tearfully confessed to her desperate flight and the heartbreaking decision to leave the infant Juliet on a church's steps. The only way she knew to keep the child safe and truly free from the family's corrupting influence. As her story concluded, Thorne stepped forward, corroborating her account with his own findings. The cleanly cut wires on the emergency beacon, the pieces formed a monstrous image, and all eyes fell on Richard. It was not an accident, was it, Richard? Beatrice's voice was unnervingly soft. She accused him not of active murder, but of a colder sin, knowing their father's secrets, knowing Edward was a threat, and simply letting him sail into a deadly storm. His crime was a calculated, ambitious silence. Richard's denials crumbled under the weight of the truth. He didn't confess with words, but with a single defeated slump of his shoulders. He sank into a chair, a king exposed in his own crumbling castle, finally broken by a secret that had refused to stay buried. The aftermath of the confession was not a storm, but a quiet, crushing collapse. Choosing a private justice over a public scandal, Beatrice stripped Richard of his power. He was removed as CEO and exiled to a remote property. His punishment a life of irrelevance, a fate worse than prison for a man defined by his ambition. The Sterling fortune was radically restructured. Beatrice and Annalise established the Edward and Laura Sterling Foundation, a massive charitable trust dedicated to the arts. A significant portion of the estate was placed in a personal trust for Juliet Sterling, granting her the independence her father had always wanted. Annalise, still Annalise in soul, rejected high society. Her first act was not to indulge in luxury, but to secure the nation's best medical specialists for her brother Daniel. His health rapidly improved, and seeing him breathe easily was her greatest reward. Together they started a new life grounded in normalcy rather than opulence. She forged a delicate healing bond with Beatrice built on shared grief and redemption. From Fiona Malloud, she received the gift of memory, learning about the kind parents she never knew. One afternoon, Annalise looked at the silvery mark on her forearm. The sterling dove had been a map leading her through a labyrinth of lies to a liberating truth. It had brought her home not to the cold stone of a mansion, but to a future she could forge on her own terms. One where the Sterling legacy would be redefined by compassion, not by the sins of the past. Annalise's journey shows us that truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of coming to the surface. It reminds us that family is not just about blood or a name, but about the choices we make and the love we fight to protect. Her scar was not a flaw, but a key that unlocked her past and freed her future. What began in a humble diner ended with the transformation of a dynasty, proving that one person's courage can rewrite history. What did you think of Annalise's incredible story? Was Beatrix's form of justice for Richard the right choice, or should he have faced legal consequences? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of secrets, betrayal, and ultimate redemption moved you, please give this video a thumbs up. Share it with someone who loves a powerful drama, and don't forget to subscribe for more unforgettable real-life stories.